humans have always struggled with what to do with their waste. And as wastes have gotten more complicated, the struggle has gotten more complicated. Some people call it trash, some people call it garbage, some people call it solid waste, but whatever you call it, it's an issue that isn't going to go away. Whenever people settle in one spot, especially in large numbers, then they're going to generate a lot of waste. This has been a problem since the Greek times, when the Greeks noticed this problem and they designated waste sites outside of the city, so old school landfills, where people would deposit waste so that the waste wasn't hanging around inside of their civilization, causing disease and illness. I guess disease is illness. One of the first cases in more modern history of a problem with waste was the Black Death in the 1300s. It was also known as the bubonic plague. And part of the contribution of this was Europe was getting very crowded, waste was accumulating in the streets, and so rodents moved in, and the rodents were eating all of this waste and multiplying. These rodents carried fleas through no fault of their own, so it's not like I'm trying to demonize the rats. And then the fleas would carry the plague, and if they would bite, the fleas would land on somebody, bite them. If they had the plague, they were a carrier, then they could jump back onto a rat and travel to another area and come off and bite somebody else. And so this was one way that the disease was transferred from one person to another. And the disease that caused this plague was a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. At that time, about 1.5 million people, or 25% of the population in England, died over a 12-year period, and it was just a huge toll on civilization. So fast forward again to the Industrial Revolution. People were producing products at a fast rate. Beginning in the late 1700s, this led to more consumption and more waste. It was so bad of a problem that one of our founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, and other leaders in the United States noticed that this was an issue and started to order that people dump waste outside of cities because they wanted to limit the spread of disease. It became popular at that time to burn or combust or incinerate waste, but that did lead to air quality issues, so it was kind of a trade-off. Do we burn these wastes and contribute to air quality issues in the city, or do we dispose of it and carry it outside of the city? One solution to this issue was to purchase hogs, and then the hogs were released in the city to eat the garbage, and then people would eat the hogs. And so this seemed like a great solution. I mean, the hogs can eat the waste, the people can eat the hogs, it's a win-win. The problem is that the humans who ate these hogs that were eating the garbage had an increased chance of contracting an illness called trichinosis, and so it wasn't such a great solution after all. And plus there was hogs running around the city defecating, so not really the best idea. In the 1920s, we began to produce many more synthetic chemicals, and one example of this was trichloroethylene, also known as TCE. This was a very popular degreasing agent and dry cleaning solvent, and it's not that it's not used anymore, but it's much more regulated than it used to be. These different synthetic chemicals, they were also burned or buried, just like other wastes. So they were buried often in chemical drums, but those drums could crack or leak, and so there was a potential for these chemicals to be released to the atmosphere or to water, groundwater supplies, or even to surface water if they were just sitting on top of the land. So there's a number of examples about this. We'll talk more in detail about Love Canal, which you've probably heard about. And then there's some older movies from the 80s that talked about this issue. One was called A Civil Action with John Travolta, and then Erin Brockovich was with Julia Roberts. And both are excellent movies that really discuss this issue well. So we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about Love Canal. Love Canal, if you already know about Love Canal, awesome. If you don't, then just sit, then we'll have 3 slides for you to learn more about it. So Love Canal was a fairly small canal. It was 50 feet wide and 25 feet deep. It was constructed in the late 1800s, and the idea was that it would connect the Niagara River in New York to Lake Ontario. But the project was abandoned after only a 1-mile long stretch of it was built. And so then this canal was just sitting there. So it's basically a depression in the ground. And folks came along and said, great, we'll use this as a landfill. It's already dug out. So they started to put municipal waste into that canal from 1920 to about the 1940s. So this is kind of pre-World War II. And then slightly into World War II era. In the 1940s, we have military waste are starting to be deposited there during World War II. And so then you get a lovely mixture of municipal waste and military waste. Then in the 1950s, the Hooker Chemical Company was granted a permit to dump waste there. And so this was more of those synthetic chemicals that we're talking about, not municipal waste, not food or containers, and not military waste, but synthetic chemicals, some of which, military waste some of those are synthetic chemicals. And like I said, they use 55-gallon drums to put the waste material into, seal it up, and then they were dumping the drums into that abandoned canal. They stopped doing this in 1953, and then they put a layer of clay on top of their drums, presumably to seal in the wastes. And when they sealed it up, they told the city, they said, this land has these drums in it, you really should not build on it. But the city was running out of room and they needed a place to build a school. So in the early 1950s, the school board purchased the land for $1 from the city, and they constructed 2 schools. The 99th Street School was completed in 1955, and about 400 students attended this school. And in order to serve the school, the city had to put in sewers, and then they also put an expressway in to also just provide transportation. And then finally, there was about 100 homes that were built adjacent to the school that were sold off. So you can see here, this is part of Love Canal, and this is part of Love Canal, and the school site is smack dab right in the middle of the canal. So when they were trying to figure out where to build the school, the architect came out and surveyed the site and said, oh, you can't build on this area of the canal because there's some toxic drums underneath. And so it could be an unstable place to build a school, and the foundation will crack. And so at that point, they moved the school, and they also, when they were first surveying the site, found waste drums in the area that they had planned to put the playground for the school. So they moved the site 85 feet north, which is still really close to the drums, but not on top of them. And then after they started building, the ground crumbled away, exposing more drums, and after the school was built even. And then there was a large depression in the playground area where the kids would play in the puddles whenever it rained. And that was because the land had sunk down in as it settled around the drums. So fast forward to 1962, so school's been there a few years, houses have been there a few years, and it was a really wet spring, and that caused changes to the way the water was draining. And so the water began to drain to a nearby construction site, and at that time then the chemicals began to leach even more from the waste drums and from the soil. So as that water ran across the school site, through the soils in that site, through Love Canal, it pulled that contaminated water out into the school site, into people's houses. Gardens and trees in the area turned black. Children that were playing outside would come inside with burns on their hands and feet. The air became hard to breathe, and then people that had basements or pools in their homes or in their yards found this weird chemical film on top of them, and floating on top of any water from the wet, all the water, the rain that they'd received. By the mid-1970s, a number of birth defects were reported in the region as a result of the exposure to all of these chemicals. So, I mean, when this happened, the U.S. Congress did provide federal aid, and then they came in and moved all those families who were living in the immediate area, and they bought their houses and land from them. So, as a result, the United States government said, wait a second, we can't keep allowing this to happen and bailing out cities who aren't being responsible, and bailing out companies who aren't being responsible for how they regulate their wastes. And so a number of acts were enacted. The Solid Waste Disposal Act of 1965 said that it was no longer okay to ban the open air burn. It was no longer okay to burn waste in the open air. So if you were going to burn waste, you had to put like some kind of a smokestack filter on it, or some way to prevent it just from going into your neighbor's yard, or and especially on days when there's an overcast sky. So that was the pollution controls. So if you incinerate or combust waste, you had to follow pollution controls. They also said that all commercial, municipal, industrial, and household waste had to be handled correctly in order to minimize the impact to human health and the environment. So we have now much stronger regulations on what is a landfill and how do we design a landfill so that waste, so you don't have leaching of chemicals from the waste into groundwater systems below. Also, the EPA was formed in 1970, as Richard Nixon signed that into law. And then in 1976, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is called RCRA, was formed. And this was a more powerful law. It said that states had to manage non-hazardous solid waste, so they had to issue any permits before you could dispose of solid waste. It put in place a national system that we use to control and monitor hazardous waste, and it's called a cradle-to-grave approach. So if you're someone who purchases hazardous chemicals, if you run a chemical, like a research lab, for example, this monitors the chemical from when it's produced till it goes to your lab and it's consumed, and then you have to provide evidence of how it was disposed, and you have to account for all of the mass of the chemical. And then finally, it regulates underground storage tanks. So if you've ever driven by a gas station that's closed and it's fenced off, often that's because the underground storage tank that holds the gasoline or diesel fuel is leaking, and that's called a LUST, a leaking underground storage tank. And when it's leaking, they have to shut down the system, pull out that leaking tank, and replace it, and then remediate the soil that surrounds the tank. And so and that's the most common source of underground soil and water pollution, is leaking underground tanks. So this act also provided a system for managing that.